reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at the table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both of you may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man," and then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes to say to you, "My friend, move up to a higher position," then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to the host who invited him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord. Through the words of the gospel, our sins be wiped away. Well, this has got to have been one of the most awkward dinners ever for Jesus. Just think about what he was facing there. Prior to this invitation to dinner, Jesus had already spent time chastising the Pharisees, going, "Woe to you, Pharisees, hypocrites," and he'd go on to describe what in the world they were doing that was so offensive to God. And so after all of these woe to yous, here Jesus is invited to dinner at the home of one of them. And one of the interesting things here is that Luke says that at that home, when he was having dinner, the people were observing him carefully. So you can just imagine what this dinner on the Sabbath must have been like. It was probably somewhat quiet, very little conversation, because everyone was staring at Jesus. They were watching him, wanting to see how he ate, getting ready to maybe pick apart something that he might do that would be wrong or offensive. Maybe straining to hear what he was saying to the person next to him in conversation. To watch his body language, to see how he felt about the people that were around him. They were trying to figure out what he was all about. The interesting thing is that as Jesus began to speak to them, we find out that not only were they watching him, but he was watching them. And his observation then became kind of the platform for teaching them a very important lesson. He was watching the way that they were trying to situate at the table and how they would try to position themselves. As Luke said, they were choosing the places of honor. As the guest, he would certainly be at the head of the table. And so he watched as these people began to try to move their way into a position where they would be in prominence as well. So at this point, he began to teach them a very important lesson about humility. Now, humility is an interesting subject to cover, a wonderful virtue of the church. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, the virtue by which a Christian acknowledges that God is the author of all good. Humility avoids inordinate ambition or pride and provides the foundation for turning to God in prayer. This was not the way that the Pharisees were behaving. Ironically, as the teachers of the law and the ones who were to represent the teachings of God to the people of Israel, how ironic that they didn't practice what they preached. Certainly they knew about humility and they probably even talked about it. Our first reading gives us a good example of one of the things that they would know definitively from the book of Sirach. where the prophet says, "My child, conduct your affairs with humility, and you will be loved more than the giver of gifts. Humble yourself the more, the greater you are, and you will find favor with God." Well, that was not what Jesus was being presented with at that time. He was seeing the Pharisees, in fact, working the opposite of humility. So he decided to teach in a very unique way by parable. And he taught them an important lesson, and is this: there are no little places, and there are no little people. All of the guests were straining for a place at the table. They were looking for a way of being near the people of power and to be near the honored guests, to be part of the focal point. And here, this is where Jesus applies this parable and says, how embarrassing would it be if there you were, seated in prominence with everybody else, they're all looking at you, and the host comes to you and says, "I'm sorry, you got to go back there." You know, it would be like going onto an airplane and being seated in first class and getting your glass of champagne and having the flight attendant come up and say, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to go back into the cattle car." And so you put your glass of champagne back on the little place next to your seat, you get up, and with everybody staring at you, there you go, to the back. That's what he's talking about. This place of prominence was something that was a part of ambition. But Jesus said, seek the lower place. And by doing so, you surrender both your ambitions and your ideals, and you simply participate in the event for what it is. That humility in taking the lowest place allows you to enjoy the event from a place of support and service. I remember back in the old days for me, back when I was still in an Anglican jurisdiction and I was serving as a bishop, and one of the things that I had to do was to screen people for holy orders, get those candidates before us, and we would begin the candidacy process and ask about their call to ministry, et cetera, and I had this one man come to me that was desiring to be ordained to a deacon and then to a priest in the Anglican church, and so I said to him, "What is your vision for ministry? What do you think that God is calling you to do?" And he looked at me very confidently and said, "I believe I'm supposed to be a bishop. How soon do you think that could happen?" And I looked at him and I thought, I didn't say it, but I thought, a lot longer than it would have been about 15 seconds ago. Ambition, wanting to seek that place of prominence, that place of presence before others. It's in the economy of the kingdom. Jesus wants to be sure that those people understood that it is God who promotes, it is God who brings people into authentic prominence. When people obtain prominence in the church any other way than God's promotion, there is no real lasting impact to what they do. But when God places people where they are supposed to be, there's lasting impact. And we see that in the lives of all of the saints. Just look at one saint, Mother Teresa, seeking the lowest place, with the lowest people, in the lowest part of the city. And God exalted her to speak to kings and princes and presidents around the world. In a work called The Weapons of the Saints, Blessed John Henry Newman writes this about this wonderful gift of humility, this virtue. He said, "There is a mysterious connection between real advancement and self-abasement. If you minister to the humble and despised, if you feed the hungry, tend the sick, succor the distressed, if you submit to insult, endure ingratitude, render good for evil, you are, as by a divine charm, given power over the world and rise among the creatures. God has established this law." A Protestant sociologist and theologian by the name of Francis Schaeffer once commented on this passage of Scripture in support of what Blessed John Henry Newman just said. And he talks about the fact that there are two real blessings that we receive by seeking the lowest place. The first, Francis Schaeffer says, is that when we seek the lowest place, it is easier for us to find times to be quiet before God, times to be quiet in the face of the Lord. Little places, he said, where I can more easily be close to God should be my preference. The higher you go, the more prominent you become, the more responsibility you have. And if you are not prepared in the inner person, if you are not prepared spiritually to handle that responsibility, you'll crash and burn. But Francis Schaeffer says, in that lowest place, you will have time to truly embrace the quiet and the times before God that you need to build your spiritual muscles. And this leads to the second blessing, that this quiet man before the Lord is then extruded, injected into God's grace through a place of leadership. How wonderful when we're the one who is invited to come up higher. How beautiful when we are the one that others look at and say, you know, I want this person to do this here for this reason. Then our spiritual muscles, strengthened in the grace that God's given us in the lower place, allow us the grace again to operate at a higher place of responsibility. So as Jesus said, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Well, Jesus also, in addition to talking to the Pharisees about seeking the lower place, began to speak to the host about the one who has that place of prominence. You see, humility is very hard to build in leaders. And especially in the church, this is something that we have to look at with regard to the fact that as clergy, we do fall into this category. We can fall into a trap also of abandoning humility for the reason of honor and influence. And we can do it through surrounding ourselves with people who can do things for us. Quid pro quo, this for that, wanting something in return for what I'm offering. It's a very natural and human attitude, but it doesn't work in the kingdom of God. And again, Jesus is challenging the host of this dinner, and in doing so, challenging leaders, saying, when you hold a lunch or a dinner, don't invite your friends or brothers or relatives, your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have repayment. In other words, don't work into the quid pro quo mentality. Don't look for what people can do for you. Don't look for those you need, but rather look to help those who need you. He says, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be, because they have an inability to pay you. This again is one of the things that Mother Teresa discovered. Leaders who practice humility are not interested in their placement around those higher up or any of those things, or looking at what others can do to help them whom they're serving. They desire to offer themselves up in service to God, as God desires to offer himself to us as well. I remember many years ago when I was in seminary, I was a part of a ministry that had been going on for many years in our community, and that ministry was called Ichthus. It was a ministry for young people where we would gather young people together for a weekend of music and teaching and deepening of their faith. And this had been going on, as I said, for many years, and we would attract around 13,000 young people every year to come to this event. Well, one year I was a part of the executive committee, and one year I was showing a visiting dignitary around the grounds and showing him what the young people were doing at that time, and kind of giving him just an overview of what this ministry was all about. And as we were walking around, he looked over, and here's this man in a tattered flannel shirt and a pair of dungarees, and he's got a stick, and he's just sticking little pieces of trash and throwing them into the bag. And he commented to me, he said, isn't that wonderful that you've even brought in some staff that will go ahead and take care of clearing out the trash for the event? That is wonderful. And I said, no, that's not somebody we hired to pick up the junk. That's Dr. Robert Lyon. He's the founder of this ministry. And there was Dr. Lyon, and this happened year after year. He trusted those of us on the committee to do the work, and he is the founder. In humility, walked around picking up trash and loving the young people he was around in the name of Jesus Christ. St. Bernard of Clairvaux says that humility is the mother of salvation. It is a virtue that is the gateway to so many other virtues in us, but it can only come through practice. You don't get humility by simply sitting there and waiting for it to fall upon you. You receive humility by seeking the lower place and serving the lowly. And when we surrender ourselves to Christ, when we desire His glory and not our own, we're just at the beginning stages of entering into that virtue. St. Augustine said, "Do you wish to rise? Begin by descending. You plan a tower to pierce the clouds? Lay first the foundation of humility." So may the words of my mouth, the meditation of our hearts, be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.